When you head to your local art store, you're likely to be confronted with a large variety of different brands and types of ink and not know where to start. So in this video, we're going to dive into a number of common ink brands and see what the differences and similarities are. Both Sumi and India inks have been around for tens of thousands of years and were likely developed in the 6 millennia BCE. The main ingredient in both were soot, and in general, the preparation never used a binding agent. But almost any ink you're going to buy today, including a Sumi or an India ink off the shelf, has both a pigment and a binder. The pigment is responsible for the color of the ink, and the binder holds that pigment together. Here are the inks we're going to be trying out today. Higgins Black India, Yasutomo Sumi Ink, P.H. Martin's Bombay, Calli by Daler-Rowney, Winsor Newton's Calligraphy Ink, and Daler-Rowney's FW line. The three things I'm interested in today are the binder, the color source, and reactivation, as all three of these determine or affect the stability of the ink. The binder affects how our ink interacts with other inks and other wet media that perhaps use a different binder. The color source is important because not all inks are colored with pigment, but some are colored with dyes. Dyes are more fugitive, aka more likely to fade, aka non-light fast, than pigments are. So if you're using an ink with a dye-based color, it's less likely to hold up over time and exposure to the sun. Finally, we're looking at what I'm calling reactivation, as this will help us understand if we can build upon our layers once they're dried or if they can still be manipulated. This is not a technical term, but I'm using the word reactivation as a stand-in for waterproofness, because waterproofness just sounds weird. Essentially, what we're talking about is whether or not your ink can be re-wet once it has already been applied and dried the first time. On your ink bottles, this is going to come in the form of the label stating if it's waterproof or not waterproof, and we'll test that today. A better term for this might be permanence, but permanence is already used to describe the light fastness and longevity of pigments in all paints, and there's a lot of confusion about that word, whether or not it means the same thing as light fastness specifically, and it depends on who you're getting your information from. I've heard paint companies describe them as separate with reasons, and others saying it's pretty much the same thing. So today we're going with reactivation. The Higgins ink uses a shellac binder, which is a commercial resin with inherently glossy finishes. So when laying it down heavily or building up multiple layers, it will dry with a glossy sheen. It's colored with PBK7, which is the same pigment used in lamp black and carbon black. This India ink is pigmented, but Higgins makes a variety of colored India inks, and some of them are colored with dyes. You can find this information by consulting their website. The Sumi ink doesn't have a binder listed on their website and very well might not contain one. Like traditional Sumi, soot is used, and this ink is able to be reactivated. Bombay, like the Higgins, also has a variety of dye and pigment-based colors. They don't list information about their binders anywhere, but I'm willing to bet it's shellac as well, as it dries with a glossy sheen. The Calli ink line are all pigment-based, use an acrylic binder, and label themselves as waterproof, although we'll discover later that this might not be particularly true. Winsor Newton Calligraphy ink is also using an acrylic polymer and made only with pigments, but is labeled as non-waterproof, and we'll test that out in a second as well. And the Daler-Rowney FW is pigment-based, bound with an acrylic polymer, and waterproof. So that we weren't just testing on blank paper, I grabbed some acrylic paint and waterproof ink and ran a line along the bottom of my test sheet to see how the inks fared on top of other media and to get a sense of their opacity. Once those were dry, I did a basic rundown of each ink, applying a little bit at full strength, then adding a little bit of water down area to see how much the full strength ink would flow into our water. And lastly, did a quick reactivation test. This time I used a day-old test strip to make sure that the inks were completely set. As we can see here, predictably, the Yasutomo Sumi and the Winsor Calligraphy, which are the two non-waterproof inks, did reactivate quite a bit. But the Daler-Rowney Calli, the green, and the far left black, the Higgins India, did reactivate as well, even though they're not supposed to. The Bombay India and Daler-Rowney FW were indeed completely waterproof. I even had to draw a small pencil outline so you could see where the test area was. As far as interaction with other media, all the inks did pretty well, with the exception of the Sumi ink, which had a hard time adhering to both the ink and the acrylic paint that we had laid down earlier. It should be noted that this isn't a real opacity test, as any of our darker hues are always going to seem as though they're more opaque, and the one that seems the least opaque right now, the FW, can certainly be built up in subsequent layers. One additional note, I got bubbling in a lot of the ink that I laid down thickly. This is essentially a user error, and it's just a result of me being sloppy. You can avoid this by being a bit more deliberate and even in your application. In conclusion, each of these inks have their strengths, and by being familiar with those strengths, we can maximize their potential in our work.